How many of y'all know the Robert Frost poem, The Road Not Taken? Okay, when were you first exposed to that one?
8th grade, I think.
8th grade? It's a fun one. It's a fun one. You know, two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler, long as I stood, and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other, and just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet, knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. And I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. You know, I only know this song or this poem from the last couple of lines, right? That's about all I usually remember of this one. But it's a powerful one. Okay, this is the challenge. I'm missing my introductory notes. I've got everything except for my first two. We're off to a great start, aren't we? Well, you know, we were talking about in the last week or so, especially looking at last week, that there were two ways of life in which we can go. You know, we were looking into that extensively with the way that was being led by Noah after coming out of the ark, and how his culture was the only one that was supposed to really survive. His teaching, his way of life, he was the righteous man. He was the one that was blameless in the eyes of the Lord. And yet somehow or another, that other way also continued on even after the flood. Ham and his descendants and some of the other things that came up afterwards, in which all of the evil that had been destroyed before the flood made a reappearance afterward. To the point that as they were, again, cursing the way of God, they were, again, Nimrod and such, hunting down anyone who reminded them of the ways of God. And it was, those two paths were evident in life, to the point that the way of the enemy led toward Babel. And again, a time of judgment and disbursement. And here we are in this moment at the beginning of chapter 12, where we get to see this moment, you know, again, where we see the two paths of life come up again. And we get to see a great example of it in this Torah portion. Because the road that we take, the decisions that we make, you know, have a lasting impact. You know, we come to a decision, we come to a fork in the road, we come to those kind of moments, and whichever one we take, we can't necessarily go back and change and fix. We can't do it differently. Even if we were to turn around and come back to exactly the same point, you know, our experiences are still different from that point on. And you know, we want to have our focus on the destination. We want to have our focus on where do we want to get to, and that helps us make our decisions. But we come to this, where after all of what happened in the previous portion, you come through and you get to see the line of Shem. You get to see from Shem to Abram, all the way up to here. And it says that, then Adonai said to Abram, get going out from your land and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. My heart's desire is to make you into a great nation, to bless you, to make your name great, so that you may be a blessing. And my desire is to bless those who bless you, but whoever curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So he's supposed to do these certain things. He is supposed to leave his land, where he is, what he's familiar with, his relatives, his father's house, which is essentially his way of saying you need to leave behind your father's ways and the way that your father lived and the culture that he came from, because it's understood that Abram's father was an idolater. He was not somebody completely devoted to the Lord. So he had to leave that behind, and he was supposed to go to this new land, to this new way of life, to this new culture, to the ways in which God calls you. Get going, leave. This Torah portion is called what? Lech Lecha. And it actually comes from the Hebrew word halach, which means to go, to walk, to come, to a new way of life. It's where we get the word halakha, or the way, the walk. And every rabbi would have a particular halakha that his disciples would have to follow. And so the root of this term is used to refer to the Jewish law. It's the way a Jew is directed to behave in every aspect of life, encompassing civil, criminal, religious behavior. There's no part of your halakha, your walk, your way of life, in which your faith is not supposed to be directed by God. Does that make sense? And it's this halakha, it's this new way that God is calling Abram to say, you have to leave behind what you were and what came naturally for you, even what you grew up with, what you were raised with, and you were supposed to come and walk in this new way. All of us have had to make that kind of decision at some point, right? We're here. How many of us were raised this way? Those over 20? Nobody. None of us were. Okay? So this is we've had to leave some things behind to take up a new walk and a new way of life. And that is sometimes challenging. All right, this is a new halakha, a new way of life. So Abram, he hears this call, and he has to make a choice. Adonai, the Lord, he's setting before him two diverging paths, just like the poem. And he could continue on the same path that he was on previously. His family, the one that he was familiar with, the same one that his culture approved of, and that most of the world's population would be going along with. Or he could go on this path that was less traveled, this path that God had called him to. And has that decision that he made at this moment, has that made all the difference? Has that even affected us? Yes. It's hard to think that a man's decision that was, how long ago? You're talking 2,000 years plus another 2,000 years, so you're talking almost 4,000 years ago, plus or minus a few. His decision 4,000 years ago is still affecting us right now. We are still experiencing the blessing of a decision that he made that long ago. How many of us think that our decisions are that important or that insignificant? Nah, I'm not thinking my decisions are going to affect the world 4,000 years in the future. But can they? Can they affect things that... Did he have us in mind when Abram had to make that decision? I don't know if he really could picture just how far this would be going, and to the extent that he did. His decision has made all the difference for us. And if Abram chose to take this less traveled path, God, he promised to do a few things. He promised to make him into a great nation. He promised that he would be blessed by God, that he would make Abram's name great, so that he may be a blessing to others. And then there's this one about how people treat him and his descendants will affect how God treats them. That's an important thing to keep in mind. When you look at this, that word, I will make you all of these things, you'll be made into a great nation, is the word asa, which means to do, to fashion, to accomplish, or to produce. It also has the idea of appointing, ordination, to institute or bring about. And when you think about this is what God is saying. He's having to work into this. He's having to set these things in motion. He's having to direct things to where the outcome that He chooses and decides will come to pass. And what happens when God begins a good work? What does Philippians have to say? I am sure of this very thing. This is Paul writing. He says that He who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Messiah Yeshua. Is that a true statement even of what He said He was going to do for Abram? Yeah. It was still true 4,000 years ago, as it is true for us today. He began a good work. And it's not finished yet. It's not over yet. It's not completed yet. There are still things that have to happen in order for it to, all the promises of God to be fulfilled. And what we take hope in is just as He started that work, really He started it even before Abram. But as He started that work back then, that promise that was made, it's still being carried out. And the things that we see going on in the world today, all of the actions, all of the turmoil, all the things going on over in the Middle East, all the things happening toward Israel, the Jewish people and all that stuff, guess what? He's still working to complete that promise. That He will make him into a great nation, that He will bless him and make Abram's name great, so that he may continue to be a blessing to the world. Again, we've already established we're still living in the blessing from that decision that He made. He says He'll make it great, and that's that word gadol. We sing the song Gadol Elohai. Great is our God and such. It's large in magnitude, extent, and number, and intensity, and importance. But it also has the connotation of it where you're twisting and binding things together like twine or like thread. You're taking all of these different pieces, all of these different parts, and you're working it together to make it greater or stronger than it is by itself. And it has the first usage of Gadol is where it's talking about the great lights from Genesis, the sun and the moon. So this is what He has promised to do. This is what He is going to. He is working in Abram's life and saying He's going to do. So the means by which God will make Abram's name great. Have you ever thought about that? How is He going to do it? What does He say? What does He intend to do in order to make Abram all of these things that He said? And it's the way that He has called him to walk. The way that He has called Abram to walk is that means, is that mechanism that He is going to use to change Abram into a light for the nations. This is that new halakha. As Abram walks in this new halakha, in this new way, this new walk, and the longer Abram obeys and walks in this halakha, the greater his name will become. The longer, the more he obeys, the greater his name will become. And God will complete the work of making Abram's name great. And you get to see some evidence of this process in chapter 17, just a few chapters later, where He says, no longer will your name be Abram, but your name will be Abraham, because I make you the father of a multitude of nations. Yes, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings will come from you. Abram, his name already means exalted father. So even being called that is an important name, but it's also a bit of an irony to it, because at this point in his life, how many children does he have? 0. Well, when he's first called in Genesis 12, he had 0. He'd been called Abram, exalted father, his whole life, and he wasn't able to have children. That would probably begin to grate on you after a while. Your name was a reminder of the fact that I don't have any children, and it really bothered him. And then, he is called Abraham, the father of many nations, and that word is the goyim and such. And one of the things that we need to keep in mind when you look at Abram, it's more nations than just Israel, more than just the Jewish people descend and come from and fall into this umbrella from Abraham. It's not necessarily just a physical thing, but it is also a spiritual thing. Are we not spiritual children of Abraham? Yes, by faith. We are a nation, we are a people that looks to him as our patriarch, as the father and such like that. So many nations will live in the legacy, will live in the faith that Abraham establishes by his walk of faith. And he says great leaders will come from him. Kings will come forth from him. And not all of them are necessarily the kings of Israel. But what we need to realize is many Christians, many of those of us who grew up in the church and all that, we know the name, but we don't highly regard the name as much as we should, the name of Abram and Abraham and such. It's not as important to us as it is to the Jewish people. We don't have as much of a connection to, we don't identify ourselves with the patriarchs as much as we should. And our hearts are as his descendants and as those who are experiencing the blessing that his life has brought, we need to have our hearts turned back toward the fathers and the choice that they made to take that less traveled path, because we still have that same kind of choice to make ourselves. God has fulfilled his promise to make Abram's name great, whether we recognize it or not. The Father has brought Abraham to this diverging path. He's giving him a choice in chapter 12. And he took that path. He answered that call to go, to get going out from his land. And he then worshipped Adonai along the way, all along the way when he arrived. He even built an altar for him. More than once. Back in chapter 12, when he's there getting into the land of Canaan, it says, Then Adonai appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your seed. So there he built an altar to Adonai who has appeared to him. God is already promising to give him descendants, and he doesn't have any yet. He built this altar to Adonai who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the mountain to the east of Bethel and erected his tent with Bethel to the west and Ai to the east. There he built an altar to Adonai and called on the name of Adonai. Y'all notice what's missing from this statement that we talked about last week? Where it says he called on the name of Adonai. It comes out of Genesis 4:26. When you read at the end of that verse, and you read again about Nimrod and some of them later on, where it says he began to call on the Lord's name, Adonai's name. That word began, halal, is to profane, to make common, to defile, pollute, or to violate the honor of, to dishonor. That statement's not there when it talks about Abram building the altar and calling on the name of the Lord. So when these guys were doing it at the end of chapter 4, it was, again, very negative and very profaning of God. When Abram does it, that statement's not there, and so he is doing it the right way. He is honoring God. He is exalting him. Abram does not halal Adonai's name. Instead, he worships the Father in spirit and in truth. He is walking this path rightly, correctly, the way he is supposed to. Abram is faithfully walking out this halakha from the Father. And that's a good thing. He's demonstrating that, you can walk that way. And the great thing about this halakha is that Abram is being called to, is that it's open for others to go with him, to join with him, to be a part of it. Verse 4 says, so Abram went, just as Adonai had spoken to him. Also, Lot went with him. So he didn't go just by himself. So it says, now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran, which is in like northwestern Iraq and such. Is anything happening over there these days? Is that area, is that part of the world still important? Yeah, there are things still going on in that same territory right now that even our president and our country and our troops are involved in. So he's leaving this part. It says, Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his nephew, and all their possessions that they had acquired, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they left to go to the land of Canaan, and they entered the land of Canaan. So he is not going by himself. He didn't go alone on this new walk, and though he was leaving a lot of things behind, he was leaving a lot of people behind, a land behind, a different way of life behind, he also got to take some with him. His wife, his nephew Lot, whom he had likely brought into his family, because it says in there at the end of chapter 11 that Lot's father Haran had died. So he had taken him into his family. So he had a charge of a lot of people. He was responsible for a lot of people already. But they all came with him. They all came with Abram on this halakha and entered into the land of Canaan. Lot went with him. And when the path diverged in the wood and Abram took the one less traveled by, Lot started that path with him. Lot worshipped at that altar and called on the name of Adonai. Again, that's one of the good things about this walk, this invitation, is that this halakha, it's open for others to join. And Lot, apparently, for all indication, joined in. Not just traveling to a new destination physically, but to this new way of life. At least he seemed to for a time. For a time, even Lot, received this way of life, received this word and this calling. What he didn't realize, and what so many times we take for granted either, because we don't recognize it either, is that, how many of y'all know the path of God takes many twists and turns that we don't always expect or don't always see coming? Anybody else have experience with that? He goes in ways and places that we don't always expect, and there are decisions all along the way. Everywhere we walk, everywhere we go in life, we're having to make decisions. There are many points of divergence in which it's possible to get off the path, to stop walking in the ways of God, to stop. We're so pulled and tempted and tried to make decisions that in ways that compromise. So it's so easy to get off the path. The path of God, is a lot like the interstate with a lot of exit ramps, but limited entry ramps, right? How many entry ramps are there really on the path of God? There's one. Yeshua is the way, the truth, and the life. No one gets on that path to the Father except through Him. I don't know if y'all can see that very well. I made that this morning. There's the interstate going, which has a lot of lanes to it. It's easy to get on that path, but if you want to make it over to the Father, you have to take the exit. You have to start going toward Yeshua. You have to follow that. What's that?
Hope you're not driving that car.
Sometimes we don't see the exit until the last second, and we have to crank that wheel a little harder. When Jesus takes the wheel, He doesn't say He's going to drive it. He might be a NASCAR driver. You never know. But once you've taken that exit, it's easy to get off the path. Once you've taken Yeshua, once you've accepted Yeshua, the way to get back on the path is repentance, is teshuvah. That's how we come back. We turn around, we back up, we essentially go the wrong way on the exit ramp and back up coming to Yeshua and get back on the right way. Again, Lot initially went with Abram on this call. He worshiped at the altar that Abram built. But even Lot had a choice to make. You know, as they were there together in the land, walking in this new way of life, Lot had a choice. It says, now Lot, who was walking with Abram, also had sheep, cattle, and tents, so that the land could not support them living together because their possessions were many, and they were not able to stay together. And so there was a quarrel between the shepherds of Abram's livestock and the shepherds of Lot's livestock. And now the Canaanites and the Perizzites were living in the land then. Okay? It goes on, it says, so Abram said to Lot, please, let there be no strife between me and you, or between my shepherds and yours, since we are relatives. You know, we're walking on this path together. We're here together. We're supposed to be unified in who we are. So isn't the whole land before you? Please separate yourself from me. If to the left, then I'll go to the right. And if to the right, then I will go to the left. All right, is he trying to keep the peace between them? Yeah. Both Abram and Lot were doing well in life. They were both getting ahead and acquiring property and things like that. Lot was being blessed in this halakha by being with Abram and walking in that pathway of life. But they were being so successful that they began to get in each other's way. So they were beginning to fight for space and resources. So rather than let the tensions keep escalating, rather than this conflict to be developing, Abram does what the New Testament talks about, says, where as much as it depends upon you, live at peace with all men. He says, he proposed that they separate. In whichever direction Lot took, Abram would go the other. It's like, look, you make the decision, you go where you want, and we'll maintain our friendship, we'll maintain our connection with one another. But here's the thing, even though they were going in different directions, does that mean that they had to go on different paths and live by a different halakha? Even though as Lot went to the right and Abram went to the left, could they still live the same way? Yes. Right? They could still walk with the Lord whichever direction they took. Could Lot have continued with the halakha of Adonai even though he's separated from Abram? Yeah, he could have. He could have kept walking that way. But Lot's decision process kind of gives us a picture of what's going on in his heart. Because we need to understand we are constantly coming to paths that are diverging and forcing us to decide which halakha we will take. Which path in the woods, so to speak, we will take. God's ways, God's halakha, His walk, or the way of the world. And it's tempting. It's not always an easy decision. It wasn't for Lot either. It says, Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the whole area surrounding the Jordan was well watered in its entirety, before Adonai destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So what we see of this territory around the Jordan River and south, what we see of it now was not the way it was at the time. It's changed a lot since this day. The judgment of God has affected the entire area. Now it's pretty barren. Now it's pretty dry and not a whole lot of things grow there. But at the time, it wasn't like that. It says it was like the Lord's garden, Adonai's garden, like the land of Egypt, until you come to Zoar. So Lot chose for himself the whole area surrounding the Jordan. Lot journeyed to the east, and they separated from each other. That's one thing that the enemy likes to do. One of the ways that he operates is he always wants to make his path, his halakha, his way of life look good, look enticing, look easy, a lot more comfortable. Because when Lot was looking down at the valley, at the Jordan and such like that, it's not in the mountain. It's got plenty of water. There's plenty of resources. There's variety. There's even cities down there that probably looked good from a distance. Lot chose the path that looked better, the one that was more worn. He chose the path that was the easier one, the path that looked to him like it would be the path of abundance, of luxury, of comfort. But was that reality? Did it look good, but did it end good? See, it didn't necessarily end good. It took him closer and closer to the cesspools of evil. You know, the path that God, or the path that the enemy wants to get us to the bad place, to the places in life where our lives are in trouble and destroyed and a mess. Nobody starts and jumps right into the mess. It's usually one step and another step. It usually starts off with something innocent, something that seems harmless, something that seems like it's not a big deal, and then eventually it gets you to the mess. That's so often how it works. Verse 12 says, Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the valley, and he moved his tent from place to place near where? Now Sodom, near Sodom. But Sodom does not have a good reputation. Still does not have a good reputation. The people of Sodom were evil, it says, very great sinners against Adonai. Further that Lot went away from Abram was the further that he went away from that halakha of God, that walk of God, and the further he went away from God. The more he began to see all of those good things and be enticed by all of those good things, the further away he went. You know, Lot had to make his own decisions about how he was going to live. Abram was no longer the man in charge, the man telling him how we're going to do things. He couldn't rely on Abram or Abram's faith to make decisions for him. And again, you know, we as parents, isn't that how we hope to raise our children? You know, when they're with us, they come under our protection, they come under our provision and such like that, but we hope to raise them that when they are on their own, that they begin to make their own decisions, that they will recognize the way, the halakha that they've been raised or taught in, and the hope is that they will continue in it. That they will continue in that walk, regardless of how the proximity to us, right? You know, at some point they're going to go and be on their own in some form or fashion. And no matter how far away they are, we want them to continue to live with the values and the beliefs and the things that we have raised them with. So like for our children, we have to be praying for our kids that when those moments come, when those divergences in the woods, you know, come, that they'll be able to see and recognize God's way versus the way of the world, that they'll see that the enticements of the world that will pull at them. And remember, again, Lot was with Abram. Lot was worshiping there at those altars and such. And in Lot's life, in a lot of ways, his walk reminds me of the parable of the soils in Mark chapter 4. You know, it says, Yeshua began to teach by the sea. A large crowd gathered around him, so he got into a boat on the sea and sat down. And the crowd was by the sea on the land. He began teaching them many things by parables, and in his teaching he said to them, Listen, behold, a sower went out to spread some seed, and it happened that as he sowed, some fell beside the road, the birds came and ate it up. I lost my place. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it didn't have much soil. And it sprang up immediately because the soil was not deep. But when the sun came up, it was scorched, and because it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew and choked it, and it yielded no crop. And others fell into the good soil, and were producing fruit, springing up and increasing. They yielded a crop producing 30, 60, and 100-fold what was sown. Which one do you think of these that did Abram exemplify, of these soils? Doesn't he exemplify what happens when the word, the halakha, the way of God, lands on good soil? See, that's how Yeshua begins to interpret it. He says, the sower sows the word. And try to see where Lot's life shows up in here. It says, these are the ones beside the road where the word is sown. Whenever they hear, Satan comes quickly and takes away the word that has been sown in them. These are the ones sown on rocky ground. When they hear the word, immediately they receive it with joy. And they have no root in themselves, but last only a short while. And when trouble or persecution comes because of the word, immediately they fall away. We've seen people like this. They come, they join in, they are part of it for a little while, but it's gone as soon as something else comes up. And then he says, there are others sown among the thorns. They have heard the word, but the worries of this world, or the seduction of wealth, and the desires for other things enter and choke the word, and becomes unfruitful. And then there are the ones sown on the good soil. They hear the word and accept it, and produce fruit 30, 60, and 100-fold. Abram is definitely down here, because we're still living in the fruit of Abram's walk and his reception of the word. Lot definitely seems to be up here. He's the one that has become unfruitful in his walk because other things took precedence, other things gave the desire, gave him a different way to go. He seems to exemplify what happens when the worries or the seductions of the world choke out one's faith and causes them to be unfruitful. So Lot came to live and tolerate the worst of the world in Sodom and Gomorrah. He tolerated the worst of that. Even after being with Abram, even after walking that path of God for a time, all the things that they had been called to leave, Lot began to accept. The more we get away from the authority of God's word, the more that we get away from his way of life, his halakha, the walk of God, then the more that we're going to tolerate evil in our lives. The more we're going to be comfortable with it, the more we're going to accept it, to the point that it became hard to tell the difference between Lot's lives and the lives of the citizens of Sodom. He was living right there in the midst of it, accepting it. Because of Lot's decisions and his way of life, his halakha that he was accepting, his life became in greater and greater danger because of that. And now the struggle for Abram, do the decisions of people we care about still affect us? Sure they do. See, the struggle for Abram is that he didn't stop caring about his nephew. He didn't stop caring about his life or the things that he did or the decisions that he made just because they parted ways and Lot began making bad decisions. Because when the word reached Abram that Lot had been captured, Abram and his herdsmen took action to rescue Lot from the dangers of sin and his acceptance of them. We see that in chapter 14. It says, when Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he rallied his trained men, those born in his household, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Then he divided his servants against them at night, and he defeated them and pursued them as far as Hovah, which is in north of Damascus. And he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot and his possessions, as well as the women and the other people. Now that's a pretty impressive feat when you consider it was 5 kings, 5 essentially nations and cities that were coming down and attacking this territory. 4 kings that were attacking, it was 5 that were defending. I had it backwards. Thank you, dear. But how many people did he take? 318. Can you imagine 318 people going up against Knoxville and winning? Whatever they did, the Lord was definitely with them. But how often, when you think about it, how often are we put in situations like this, where our loved ones, our family, our children, friends that we see are going down the wrong path, and you hear that they have fallen into some kind of captivity, some sort of danger in their life? Should we go after them? Should we try to rescue them from that? Yeah, we should. I mean, Abram is an example of that. He did, and he lived by the halakha, the way of God. But we also need to realize that Abram had to fight and defeat great odds to get him back. Because sometimes the enemy, we need to realize this, sometimes the enemy will use our friends and our family to get to us. To get us off of the path of God. The Midrash and some of these things, the writings and the commentaries about this, Bereshit Rabbah 42 explains that this entire incident, this is the way some of them view it, that this entire incident of the war and its motivation in capturing Lot was just to get after Abraham and kill him. That this is a return to the pattern that we saw of the Nephilim and Nimrod, who want to hunt down and kill anyone who walks with the halakha of God. Is that still going on? Yes. Is that going to be going on in the future? Yes. Satan wants to target people who keep the commandments and hold to the testimony of Yeshua. He wants to wipe those people off the planet. All right? This strategy of the enemy has been the same this whole time. And it keeps repeating itself. So he's going after Lot to try to get to Abraham. And it says, I found also in that article, it says the Zohar sees this war as ideological. It specifically targets Abraham the upright, the one who is different from the others, to rid the world of him and his teaching about God. If he can end them, if he can end Abram, then all of the promises of God, all of the judgments of God against the enemy that he made are going to come unraveled in his mind. And so that's why the Jewish people have always been targeted over and over again throughout the scriptures and throughout history to be destroyed, because if Satan can kill them off, then Messiah can't come, or then that all of those prophecies and things that are promised cannot happen. But again, even with just 318 people, God gives the victory. He is walking that halakha, he's walking that way. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Abram wins this victory, takes back Lot. And again, Lot is given a choice. Sometimes when we help somebody and we bring them out of their terrible situation, what do we have to say to them at that point? Okay, you're in a good place right now. What are you going to do? Are you going to keep out of that, or are you going to walk right back into it? What does Lot choose to do? He walks right back in. How many times have we seen that? All right? Because Lot is given this choice. He once again gets to see the path and the blessing of God. He even gets to join Abram in some way, or he's there at least, in true worship with Melchizedek, because Melchizedek, the king of Salem, he brings out bread and wine. He brings out essentially a meal of fellowship, a communion-like thing, or even a Passover kind of thing. What's that? A covenant meal. says he was a priest of El Elyon. He blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram by El Elyon, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be El Elyon, who gave over your enemies into your hand." And then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. But it wasn't just Melchizedek that came out to meet Abram, was it? No, the king of Sodom also came out to meet Abram. But he didn't bring the bread and the wine. He just came out wanting, the people return. He wanted his stuff back. And he magnanimously offered to let Abram keep the spoils as a reward. But in a lot of ways, this was a payoff, a bribe to get his hooks into Abram in the same way that he had gotten them into Lot. Because if he can get Abram hooked in, then all of this changes. The king of Sodom could see clearly who the real power was. He could see the hand of God in Abram's life, and the enemy wanted to compromise him. But thankfully, Abram was able to see through that. But when we have those moments, when we have to rescue our friends or our family, those that we love, going down the wrong path, we do have to realize that it is dangerous for us to do so. There is a risk involved in us doing so, even for if we're on the right path. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 10. It says, "These things happened to them as an example." It's talking about the testimony from the scriptures in the Old Testament and such. "It was written down as a warning to us on whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let the one who thinks that he stands watch out that he doesn't fall." We always have to be mindful. We always have to be careful, even when we're trying to do the right thing, that the enemy is going to try to take us off the path, even in those moments. Sometimes the bad things going on in somebody else's life is an attempt to target you and put you at a greater risk, or put you in a place of compromise. Because that's one thing we have to realize, is that there are no non-combatants in the war between heaven and hell. There are no innocent bystanders when it comes to the enemy. He will use anyone and anything to get at us, the people of God. Our heart's desire is to save them, but again, they still have a choice to make. They may be saved through fire, right? If anyone's work is burned up, he'll suffer loss. He himself will be saved, but as through the fire. And doesn't that sound like Lot? He makes it out of Sodom, doesn't he? When the judgment comes? By how much? Just barely makes it out. In fact, his wife obviously does not. And he barely makes it out of the valley where all that things come. He barely makes it out. Even though he is saved by Abram, even though he's reminded of the right way to walk, he ends up right back where he was, back in Sodom. And Lot is saved through the fire because Lot chose to get away from the halakha of God and the example of Abram. Meanwhile, the other way to live, the alternative, Abraham is showing us what that really looks like. And when he gets to see in chapter 15, all of these promises, he recognizes the problem. I don't have any descendants. I don't have any children. He talks about the servant Eleazar of Damascus being the one who inherits the promise. And he's like, no, it's not going to come from him. It's one from your own body. You go outside, you see the stars. If you can count them, count them. But that's how many descendants you're going to be. That's how many you're going to have. So when Abram hears about this future from God, even though it's not something that's right in front of him at that moment, it says he believed. He believed in Adonai, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. Did God explain everything to him? Did God lay out every twist and turn of his plan and his walk and his way of life. No. And yet, did he believe? Yes. He believed that the one who said he was going to do it was going to do it. And so we have to understand that the walk of faith is not one where we always get all the answers. The walk of faith is not one where everything is laid out nice and smooth for us. But we still have to believe and trust and walk. And Abram doesn't always do that perfectly. But is he able to continue in his walk with the Lord? Is he able to come back and renew his relationship with the Lord? He believed and he continued to walk in that. Essentially, what is that road less traveled? And so because of that, because he walked that path, his name was made great and changed to Abraham, the father of many nations. So we get this example again of the two pathways, the two ways of life in which we can go. And if you and I, if we want our lives to matter, if we want our decisions to have significance, we too have to make that same kind of moment when we come to that calling of God, when he calls us and takes our life in a different direction than what everybody else is going. We have to be willing to take that road less traveled. We must stick to it even when those we love and care for don't always go with us. And that's not always easy. Even when the world comes after us because of it, we have to be willing to continue in the walk that God has for us, that the Father has for us. Because where does it end? Does it end in defeat? Does it end in suffering? Does it end in all the terrible things? Or is the victory in the resurrection? Is the victory in, there is that victory in all of those things? Where he is taking us, the destination is so much greater than anything that can get us off the path now. It makes all the difference in the world, the path that we choose to take. So let's just continue to choose and walk in him.